All right, let's take a look at Unit 6, where we're going to take a look at financial planning, the profession, in the series as part 2. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. So I always like to start off with this cartoon slide, right? And the cartoon basically says, how important are ethics in today's society? And you see everyone basically cheating off of the person in the center of the picture. And so we know that ethics are a huge deal in the financial planning profession, right? We're in a trust-based profession, and having good ethics and a framework to ensure that ethical standards are upheld are extremely important. Now, ethics aren't law. We know this, right? Ethics are judgments based on the rightness or wrongness of conduct. And so to make this work well for the profession, then we really need to establish what framework are we going to operate under to ensure that the ethical standards of being a CFP are upheld. Okay, so the CFP board basically says, hey, listen, we're going to use a principles-based framework. And at the top of this framework, we're going to place the fiduciary standard, right? So put the client's best interest ahead of your own and act in that client's best interest. Now, what's really nice about this principle-based standard is, theoretically speaking, you don't even need rules, right? It's a simple question. Am I putting the client's best interest ahead of my own? And am I doing everything that I possibly can to act in that client's best interest, right? And if you can answer yes to those two questions, then everything else falls under that ideal. Okay, now we do provide some structure underneath the standards to ensure that we're operating in a fiduciary capacity, but ultimately the standard sets the bar at a really high level. Okay, now when we think about financial planning, we like to think about it from a professional perspective, right? We don't want to just be an industry. We want to be a profession. And so what makes up a profession? Well, we kind of see here on this slide the things that go into that, right? A specialized body of knowledge that's unique and requires education and significant experience to obtain. We have to have a threshold for entry, right? It can't be an absolutely open entry profession. Now, one of the things that I personally think holds the market for financial advice back from accelerating as a true profession is a lower bar to entry, right? As it currently stands, anyone can go into the marketplace, no education, no credentialing, and they can hold themselves out to the public as a financial advisor. And they can give financial advice for compensation as long as people are willing to pay them in that marketplace. And so it creates a market for bad players. And when consumers interact with bad players, it can compromise the integrity and the trust of that marketplace, which in turn reduces potentially consumer demand. All right, so I think if financial planning was really going to go above and beyond, very much like the accounting profession or the law profession or even the medical profession, we would raise the barrier to entry to make it more difficult for people to enter. Okay, there also has to be a sense of altruism, right? And that basically means a sense of putting others ahead of myself. Now, that's very much in line with the fiduciary standard, and then a code of ethics that illustrates how to uphold the higher standard. Okay, so on the code of ethics, one of the things that you'll notice is that there are a variety of code of ethics that might apply to a financial planning professional based on, first of all, their certification. Are they a CFP or not? And then potentially professional organizations that they're associated with. And so we see that beyond the CFP board, the FPA or NAPFA also have ethical standards that they expect their members to uphold. FPA, again, stands for Financial Planning Association, and NAPFA stands for the National Association of Personal Fee-Only Advisors. All right, now we also have to have fitness standards, and this kind of goes back to that barrier to entry. Now, to be a CFP, we know that we have to have the 4 E's, right? We have to have a degree, so that's education, and that degree has to include education that is directly related to the requirements set forth by the CFP board to be able to sit for the exam. Doesn't have to be a degree in financial planning, but you do have to have a completed board registered program as part of your educational component. Okay, you have to pass an exam, a comprehensive 6-hour exam that covers the principal knowledge topics associated with the mark, right? We have to have experience. Okay, if you're under the apprenticeship model, that would be 2 years of experience working directly under a CFP, or 3 years of experience when you don't have a CFP as a direct supervisor. And then ethics, right? I have to pledge to uphold the ethical standards of the mark, right? So that's the 4 E's, and those things are absolutely required as barriers to entry. But fitness standards fall even before we get to the 4 E's, right? And so we want to make sure that we are working with people that are going to uphold the mark that, again, are trustworthy to the public, right? And so here we see that there are certain things that would always bar someone from a CFP certification, right? I'm not going to read these to you, but you can see felony conviction for theft and other financial-based crimes, felony conviction for tax fraud or other tax-related items, revocation of a professional license, felony conviction for physical crimes, and felony conviction for murder or rape, right? So those things are pretty significant offenses that would compromise market trust, and so those things would always prevent someone from being a CFP. Now, there are other things that might be presumed to bar someone from entering the profession, right? And you can see the list here. These things are less significant than what we see on the always bar, but more likely than not, if these things are on an individual's record, they would not be able to hold the CFP mark. Now, they could appeal to the CFP board, and the CFP board could grant that appeal and allow them to go through the education, exam, experience, ethics process to become a CFP professional, but it would require an appeal process to be granted access. Okay. Now, if something happens where you fall on that list, this is kind of the process that you would go through for an appeal. And again, ultimately, we want to make sure that people that the public can trust are in the profession, and that we have a good set of standards that apply to the people practicing financial planning. Okay. Now, something to note really quickly. Once you finish your education requirement, you can call yourself a CFP candidate for up to 5 years, but you can't put that on your business cards. And so what that means is that you can hold yourself out as eligible to sit for the CFP exam. That's what CFP candidate means. Now, once that 5-year mark passes, if you haven't passed the exam, then you would have to remove CFP candidate from anything that you were promoting to the public. A CFP certificate is someone who's currently registered with the CFP board, and then a CFP registrant, that's someone that's registered to potentially be a CFP holder, but doesn't currently hold the marks for one reason or another, right? We're not going to hold ourselves out as a CFP registrant, but we could hold ourselves out as a CFP candidate if that was something that applied, or once we have the CFP marks in place, we can report ourselves as a CFP. Now, when we're looking at the CFP board's code of ethics, here's basically what they outline underneath the fiduciary standard as the principles that CFP professionals should abide by. And again, I'm not going to read these things to you, but the things that you see on this list probably make a lot of sense, right? These are qualities that would ensure that the CFP is working diligently for their clients. These are qualities that would ensure to the client that the CFP is trustworthy in everything that they do to serve the client, and that the client can have faith in the fiduciary standard that the CFP is required to operate under, right? That standard of best interest of the client. Okay, now underneath the code of ethics, we have standards of conduct. And so if you're thinking about this from a hierarchy, right, we start at the highest level where we have this big overarching principle of fiduciary standard. And then right underneath that, we have, hey, listen, these are the ethical standards that a fiduciary should uphold. And then right under that, we have the conduct that people should engage in if they're going to abide by the ethical standards. And so you can see that we're kind of walking this down the funnel to be more and more narrow and more direct with regards to what the expectations are to abide by the framework put forth by the CFP board. Okay, so they have this broken down into 6 different elements. And basically, it is the different duties required of a CFP. So the duties owed to a client, how the CFP engages in the financial planning process when providing financial advice, the practice standards that are going to support that process, and then duties owed to the firm, duties owed to the CFP board, and then how we basically serve the profession well. Okay, so there's a nice roadmap that the CFP board put out to really make a lot of sense of this, right? So the next slides that we're going to see in this presentation are going to represent a lot of the requirements set forth by that roadmap, okay? And so I'm going to give you an overview that will be a nice reference point for you to come back to as you really think about what does it mean to operate under the overarching framework of the board. Now, before we get into this, I do want to note that under the standards of conduct, we have our practice standards, and the practice standards really relate to this number 2 or part B here, right? So how do we actually engage in the financial planning process to ensure quality outcomes on a consistent basis for the clients that we serve? All right, so that's where the financial planning process lives. Okay, so that 7-step process that we talked about in financial planning part 1 at the beginning of the semester falls under the practice standards. And the practice standards not only name that process, but they also name some of the duties and responsibilities that fall to the CFP under each step in that process. So I just wanted to make note of that with regards to the structure and setup set forth by the CFP board. All right, so duties of a CFP professional. Now you'll notice that CFP professionals have 3 different categories when we think about the duties that they're responsible for in the day-to-day interactions that they have with their clientele. Okay, and so the first thing that we have is duties they're responsible for at all times, right? And you can see that the list at all times is the biggest, right? And so regardless of whether or not they're providing financial advice, regardless of whether or not they're providing financial planning, these are the professional standards that the board says are expectations for CFPs at all times. Now, there's a lot of information there, but you're not going to be surprised as you read these lists that that would be an expectation for CFPs. Now, there is a difference between financial advice and financial planning. And generally speaking, and by the way, you'll hear this defined in a little bit different way. The way I like to define the difference between financial advice and financial planning is financial advice is pretty singular in nature, right? And so we're not covering multiple topics, and we don't have the integration of different financial planning concepts coming together to produce recommendations and actions of the client, right? And so it might be recommendations for life insurance needs or recommendations for education funding, right? I'm going to provide financial advice for a specific investment, not necessarily in relation to overall retirement planning or anything like that. Just like, hey, I need a large cap stock investment to round out the asset allocation of my portfolio. I recommend this mutual fund, right? And so financial advice is very singular in nature. Financial planning, on the other hand, is more robust, includes multiple areas of financial advice, and oftentimes the integration of the different areas of financial planning to produce recommendations and an implementation plan. Okay, so that's the difference, the way I like to describe it. What you'll notice is that the expectations increase as you move down the line, right? So if you're providing financial advice, you have all the duties that apply at all times, plus the fiduciary duty, the responsibility to disclose any conflicts of interest, and then other duties for disclosure when recommending, engaging, and working with additional persons, right? Now, probably the biggest difference in my mind's eye in these duties is the application of the financial planning process. So we don't see the financial planning process required when providing financial advice, and we do see that when providing financial planning. We also don't see the requirement to provide written disclosures. But here we do see that all information disclosed to the client has to be delivered in writing to the client. Now, oftentimes CFPs will look at this potentially and say, am I providing financial advice or financial planning? But it's pretty common practice for CFP firms to just come in and say, hey, listen, regardless of whether or not we're providing financial advice or financial planning, we are going to treat all advice as if it is financial planning, and we're going to uphold our responsibilities for the full set of listed duties on this page. It's just a nice way to ensure the highest level of standard and care being provided to each client. And it's a good protection for the CFP if anything ever comes up in relation to the actions that they take with a client. All right, so when we look at the fiduciary duty, again, I think the basic definition of the fiduciary duty is that I'm going to put the client's best interest ahead of my own, and I'm going to act in those clients' best interest. Okay, but you'll notice here that we have a duty of loyalty, plus a duty of care, plus a duty to follow client instructions. Okay, and what you're going to notice in the duty of loyalty, again, a lot of that best interest language. We're going to avoid conflicts of interest, or when material conflicts exist, we're going to disclose those things, and then we're going to act in the way that we're supposed to, right? So a lot of that best interest language is in the duty of loyalty. Okay, the duty of care expands this a little bit. Not only are we going to put the client's interest ahead of our own and act in the client's best interest, but we're also going to do that with care, skill, prudence, and diligence to ensure the best possible solutions that we can provide for our clients. Okay, so the CFP board being very intentional in the way that they decide this. Now, this last little part says that the client isn't always going to agree with the financial planner's recommendations, right? And so they may come back and say, hey, listen, thank you for that recommendation. Instead of doing what you recommended, I want to do this. All right. And the financial planner may very well know that taking the action recommended by the client is not in the client's best interest in relation to their goals. But if it's not outlandish and the client understands that you are advising that this is not in their best interest, but you can help execute that plan if that's what the client wants to pursue, then you can still take action on the client's instructions. Now, on the flip side of that, if the client comes to you and gives you an alternative that's outlandish, one that you can't get behind, and one that makes you nervous with regards to being associated with implementing that instruction in relation to the client being able to meet their goals, then you can always say, hey, listen, I'm going to either reduce the scope of this engagement to where I'm not responsible for the advice in this area, or you can come to the client and say, hey, listen, I feel like this is outside of the fiduciary duty as defined by the CFP board that I owe to you as your CFP professional. And if that were the case, then you could disengage with that client. But this duty to follow client instructions in some way says that, hey, listen, even if it's not perfectly in line with the duty of loyalty and the duty of care, if the client tells you that's what they want to do, then you can still take action on those things. Okay, now I'm going to let you review this just to, again, look at the nuances between the differences in financial advice and what is not financial advice. But basically, if you wanted to put this in a nutshell, if this is general and not personal, with regards to information being provided, then it's not constituted as financial advice. Great example of this is me teaching this class, right? I'm not giving you financial advice in this class when we talk about different financial planning related topics. I'm just speaking generally about the practice of financial planning. As soon as we get personal and start to connect what we're saying to the individual goals and preferences of the individual that we're speaking with, we're transitioning into financial advice. Okay, now, once we know we're providing financial advice, the next question is, am I providing financial planning? And we looked at what the duties are when we're providing financial planning in relation to financial advice a few slides ago. Okay, so here's some questions that we can basically walk through, answer yes or no, and help us understand, all right, if we have some yeses here, do we have some integration factors? And if so, do those constitute financial planning? And in turn, how I proceed when working with my client. Okay, so have I agreed to provide financial planning? Does the advice I agreed to provide require integration? Or does the client just reasonably believe that I'm providing financial planning? Even if we say no to these two things, but the client thinks, based on the communications and interactions that they've had with us, that they can reasonably believe that they're engaging in a comprehensive integrated financial planning relationship, then we probably want to proceed accordingly. All right, and so this last one that we're under, the standards of conduct, the prohibition of circumvention, may not directly or indirectly or by another person or entity act or think that the code of standards prohibit the CFP professional from doing, right? So we're basically going to avoid bad behavior that represents the mark in a negative way. Okay, if we do violate the fiduciary standard, the code of ethics, the code of conduct, or the practice standards, then the CFP can become subject to disciplinary actions, right? And so this flow chart basically walks you through how the CFP board would deal with a complaint in relation to a CFP professional's actions. And if they find that the CFP is guilty of an infraction, they have 4 different things that they can choose from, right? They can private censure, right? So that is just an unpublished written reproach to the CFP saying, hey, listen, let's not do that again. Slap on the wrist. They can use a public letter of admonition, right? So this is a judgment that's made available to the public about a CFP's misconduct, obviously a little bit more severe than a private censure. They could potentially suspend the CFP certificate for up to 5 years, or if the offense is significant enough, they could permanently revocate the CFP mark to where that individual could no longer be a CFP. Okay. And if you wanted to see the application of the disciplinary process in some different case studies and the discipline that came down based on the infractions, then here's a link to where you can check some of that stuff out for your own entertainment. All right, folks. Well, that gets us through the Code of Ethics and Practice Standards. I'm going to follow up with a presentation over future trends in financial planning, and that will be the final lecture for Unit 6.